baby boomers.
I used to be with it.
Millennials.
Okay, boomer.
Generation X.
What's going on?
And Gen Z. What do they have in common? Not a lot, it turns out. But one thing they can agree on is that this is the political podcast they want to listen to. Welcome to Not My Generation, the political podcast that looks at political events, news, and happenings across the world and at home through a generational lens. Your hosts are Dr. Emily Stacy and Professor James Davenport, two political scientists from Rose State College. But the views expressed on this program are solely the views of the host and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. Coming up on today's program.
These ideas, whether we recognize it or not, are the basis of our civilization. And I think somehow the vaccines got associated with the lockdowns and the masking and all of that. But in fact, the vaccines were the solution to all of that.
Oh, I was hoping you would talk about that.
So I think part of what economics is all about is trying to overcome our intuitions that somebody must be in charge.
And now, here are James and Emily. Good morning, Craig Dawkins.
Good morning, sir.
For our listeners, my usual co-host, Emily Stacy, is not able to join us today. She is at another conference. And so my good friend and colleague, Craig Dawkins from Rose State College, he is the Associate Dean of the Business and Information Technology Division at Rose State College. And he teaches personal finance and economics at Rose State as well. So thank you for coming alongside and helping me out this morning.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. And we have a great guest, someone that I think Craig and I both admire his work. Alex Tabarrok is the Bartley J. Madden Chair in Economics at the Mercatus Center and Professor of Economics at George Mason University. His research interests include empirical law and economics, voting theory and alternative political institutions, health economics, and more. During the COVID pandemic, Dr. Tabarrok was an advisor to the U.S. government on using incentives to accelerate vaccine development and production. In this role, he worked with a team to develop a model for the government to allocate funds to a vaccine portfolio. He is the co-author with Dr. Tyler Cowen of the best-selling textbook, Modern Principles of Economics, and he and Cowen are the co-founders of the Marginal Revolution blog, as well as the online economics learning platform, Marginal Revolution University. Dr. Tabarrok, thank you for joining us today.
Awesome. Great to be here.
We have, so the name of this podcast is Not My Generation. So we have some icebreaker questions. And the first one is always, where do you fit in those generations? So are you millennial, Gen X, Gen Z, boomer, somewhere in between? Where do you land?
I guess I'm an X-man.
All right. Awesome. I complain to Emily often that we don't have enough Gen X folks on the show. So, and as a fellow Gen Xer, I'm always a little sensitive to that. So fantastic. What are you currently reading, watching, or listening to?
Well, it's a lot of AI, and AI. I mean, that's what's, I think we're living in an incredibly exciting and transformative time. You know, I think we're going through an intelligence revolution, which is going to be as important, if in fact more important, and it's going to happen faster than the industrial revolution. So that's what I'm thinking a lot about. I suppose what you mean is like, you know, television or something like that. There's some of that too. I like Succession was the last really good thing that I saw.
What's the either the most recent or the thing that's made the most impression on you regarding AI?
So, I mean, to see how quickly the models are advancing is just astounding. Currently, I'm writing a paper, for example, and really ChatGPT is my co-author. And I treat it just like I would a very intelligent co-author. You know, I mean, I ask it questions, it gives answers. I say, oh, no, that's not right. What about this? And then it'll say, no, you didn't take into account this. And we're debating back and forth. And it's really quite remarkable how much it's a conversation. You have a conversation with the AI. it's astounding.
Interesting. I was in an AI training session about a month ago, and the instructor was saying, today a lot of times we'll ask people, or we're skeptical if they've used AI. In academia especially, we're skeptical if they've used it, and there's all sorts of worry about plagiarism and this kind of thing. And he said, in about 5 years, maybe less, no one will even ask that question. It'll just be assumed that you use AI in the process of writing whatever it is you're writing or in your research. So I thought that was very interesting.
Absolutely.
Which of the AIs do you find the most useful? I know Chat GPT, what is it, 4 now?
03 just came out yesterday, and I use that. I actually use all of them pretty much. So the Gemini model, the 2.5 model from Google is very good. Claude is very good. Sometimes, one model is able to solve a problem or do a test, which another model is not. Sometimes one model will give me an answer and it doesn't look quite right. And I'll ask another model, hey, what do you think about this?
I did that very thing yesterday.
Yeah. I mean, it's really useful.
All right. What is your favorite or at least most used social media platform?
Yeah, I'm embarrassed to say that I'm pretty addicted to Twitter. I do tweet a lot, which I probably shouldn't. But yeah, Twitter is where I could be found quite often. X, I suppose it's called X now.
No, I can't call it X.
Yeah.
What is your favorite pastime or hobby?
So I'm very fortunate in that I like to do my job. I like my work. Economics is everywhere. I'm always thinking about economics. So I try to combine it, my work with my hobbies. And one of them would be like traveling. In the past decade or so, I've been to India a number of times. And I think about India in terms of development economics, in terms of public choice, political economy, but it's just also in exploring. It's a fascinating place to explore and to challenge yourself to try to understand a very foreign culture.
What's one event in your lifetime that has had the most impact on your personal political views?
Well, so when I was growing up, my father would often arrange sort of dinner table discussions and debate and argument. And one time we were debating sort of the value of rock and roll versus classical music. And I pointed to the Canadian group, Rush, who I was very much into, still am. And I said, look, these guys are not just, talking about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They're talking about this philosophy, this philosopher. And I said, Ayn Rand. And my mother said, oh, Ayn Rand, you'd probably like her. And she has regretted it every day since.
That's great. That is fantastic. All right, let's get into the interrogation. Not really the interrogation, but one of the reasons why I was really excited to get to visit with you is, and we'll get to this a little bit later, it really feels like there's a dearth of economics knowledge out there right now. And so I was hoping you could wade through with some of this. But one of the first things, and this is something I ask my students when I'm in, I teach, I'm political science, but we teach, I do a whole section on my American governments on economic policy. But the first thing I ask them is, what do we mean when we're talking about this thing called the economy, right? I hear it in the news all the time. It's either going up or it's going down. But what are we really talking about when we talk about the economy? And how does the study of economics help us understand that thing? So that's where I want to start.
Sure. So think about the cup of coffee that you had this morning and what kind of a miracle that is, or a marvel that is. Think about the Ethiopian farmer who got up in the morning to dry the coffee and to package the coffee and send it off. And think about all of the transportation coming on some boats and coming into the port. And then it goes to, your local roaster and it's roasted. And so all of these interactions, all happening on a voluntary basis, without command or coercion. There's nobody in charge of this entire process, who says this is how the coffee is going to work. It's all people acting out of their own self-interest, following what Adam Smith called the invisible hand, okay? And it enables you to have this fantastic cup of coffee for a relatively small amount. So when I think about the economy, what I'm thinking about is how do individuals from all over the world cooperate together on the basis of self-interest without coercion to produce things of value. And to me, that's kind of a remarkable, the fact that it happens is marvelous and remarkable. Vernon Smith, the Nobel Prize winning economist, he once said that understanding markets, the pricing system, is as fascinating and wonderful a topic and as deep and meaningful a topic as understanding how atoms, quantum physics and atoms and the birth of suns and stars in space, to understand the pricing system and markets and to help us to cooperate better is, I think, a worthy goal.
Yeah, I want to touch on a couple of things there that I think can sometimes make people think or be fascinated, and sometimes it makes people feel like very uncomfortable, right? One of the things you said was, this happens and nobody is in charge. And I know as soon as you say that, some of us are like, yes, that's right. It evolves this way. And other people are like, that's the problem. Nobody's in charge. And we got to have order imposed upon this process. So it seems like that recognition can drive people in different directions about how they perceive this process.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. We grew up in sort of evolutionary times, right, with very small groups, 200 people or so in the African savanna. And that really is where our intuitions were developed, okay? And so I think we have this natural intuition that there should be somebody in charge. There should be a big chief, It's pretty familiar. You might think about that, the big chief. And we don't have the intuition for how there can be spontaneous orders. Hayek's term, the spontaneous order. And we certainly don't have intuitions for how the entire world, how we can have cooperation. As I spent the Ethiopian farmer, all the way to the Starbucks barista, how we can have this mass cooperation, which nobody really is in charge of or plans. So I think part of what economics is all about is trying to overcome our intuitions that somebody must be in charge to try and understand these deeper complexities underneath. I mean, Adam Smith, as I mentioned, said, used the metaphor of the invisible hand. Well, it's not called invisible for nothing because most people can't see it, right? So economics is all about getting people to see the invisible hand.
Yes. And another term that you used that I think throws people, at least some people, for a loop is this self-interest, right? A lot of people equate that with, people are just selfish and they're greedy and markets just facilitate that greed and such. And I know, from my study of Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. And when he used that term self-interest, he was not talking about greed. Adam Smith would not be in the old Wall Street movie in the vein of greed is good. That's not Adam Smith. But a lot of people go in that direction. So when you say that people are operating in self-interest, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, so Adam Smith said, you don't expect your bread and your beer to come to you for altruistic reasons, for benevolent reasons alone. The baker expects to be paid and the beer maker expects to be paid. Now self-interest doesn't have to mean breaking the law or breaking morals. As you're quite right, Adam Smith was very concerned about people following moral rules. And of course, it can often be in our self-interest to follow moral rules. So it doesn't mean sort of naked self-interest, but I think we have to recognize that, and again, this goes against our intuitions, you cannot run an economy like a family. So within a family, we can operate on benevolence and love, but love is scarce. Okay. We don't have enough to go around for everyone. I got enough for, my wife, my kids, a few other people, but love is scarce. So you want to economize on love. And so you have to then design a system so that it operates not on the basis of love, but on the basis of something there is plenty of, which is self-interest. And the key is to self-interest can go in many different directions. The key is to design institutions so that self-interest produces the social good. In a communist system, in a dictatorship, the self-interest of the leaders in maintaining power can be to crush dissent and to prevent people from becoming rich and wealthy and educated, and can throw people in jail and torture them. That can be a result of self-interest. Those are bad institutions. So you want to design institutions so that self-interest is guided in ways in which it promotes the social good. And among those institutions would be markets and property rights and democracy and the rule of law and things along these lines.
Well, that brings me to another question I have. A few years back, I had the wonderful opportunity, even though I'm a political scientist, to teach economics at one of our local universities, and taught a smattering of courses for about 4 or 5 years. And one of my favorite concepts to discuss with people was just the concept of opportunity cost. And I feel like a lot of times people don't recognize that reality is everywhere we are, right? That there's never a time that you're not facing opportunity cost in the real world. But I'd like you to maybe talk to us about that a little bit, and then maybe, a couple of other really important or crucial concepts to economics and how they help us understand the world better a little bit. Can you run us through what you think are maybe the major pieces of economic thought?
Sure. Let me, since tariffs are in the news right now.
Oh, I was hoping you would talk about that.
Let me run through kind of a tariff example, which brings up opportunity costs, maybe in a way which is a little bit unexpected, but I think is important. So this is a question I wrote about recently. We know that a tariff is just a tax. It's a tax on foreign goods, on imports of foreign goods. So a tariff is just another word for a tax. Okay. Now, it's pretty obvious that a tax is going to raise the price of the foreign goods, the imported goods. But economics also shows that a tariff, a tax on foreign goods, will raise the price of domestically produced goods. Okay. And people often have a little bit of an intuition here that they think they understand it, and they get partial sort of credit. So they think, oh, I understand why a tariff will raise the price of domestic goods. It's because, they say, with less competition, the domestic producers, they'll use their greed, their self-interest to raise their prices and take advantage of monopoly power and rip us off and make lots of profits. Okay. And that's partially true, competition does tend to keep prices low, and that's a good thing. But actually, there's a deeper explanation. And the example I would use is thinking about, suppose we have a tax on imports of a wine, French and Italian wine. I was in Napa and Sonoma recently, so I was thinking about wine. As I was driving along the vineyards, enjoying the vineyards in Napa and Sonoma. So we have this tax on foreign wine. Well, people then are going to turn to buy more domestic wine, more California, Napa and Sonoma wine. But now think about what happens to the wine producers in Napa and Sonoma. With more demand, they're going to want to, increase the quantity supplied. but that's not cheap. Okay, it's not easy to do. If you want to, already the winemakers in Napa and Sonoma are using the best, most productive land that they can for growing wine. So if they want to expand, they're going to have to take wine out of other uses. Okay, they're going to have to take land, out of other uses to grow more grapes. And there's lots of other uses for the great agricultural land in Napa and Sonoma. We also grow, olives for olive oil, and there's dairy farming. Okay. And there's even, tourism and hotels and apartments. These are all alternative uses, okay, of the same land. So if we want more wine, we are going to have less olive oil and dairy. Okay? That's the opportunity cost. And that's why domestic prices go up, because as we produce more wine, we're taking more and more land and other resources out of the production of olive oil. And the increase in the price of wine says that's the cost. That's the monetary measure of what we're losing. We're losing the olive oil. We're losing the dairy, the vegetables. And what is the cost of that? That's the higher price. So the more land we devote to wine production, the less we're getting of other goods. And that's the meaning of the rise in price. So the price represents the opportunity cost. And as we produce more and more at home, the opportunity cost goes higher. So just to bring it home, you can then see, well, what's the value of trade? Why do we trade? Well, we trade internationally when the foreign producers have lower opportunity costs, when we can take that dairy and olive oil and send it to them, okay, and get more wine than if we produced it at home ourselves by using more land for wine and less land for dairy and olive oil. So I think the tariff example illustrates how fundamental this idea of opportunity cost is. And the opportunity cost fundamentally is not the dollars. The opportunity cost is the other goods we must give up in order to get more wine or more of other goods.
Yeah, I think sometimes for my students, as I'm introducing them to this concept, the idea that the money isn't the opportunity cost, right? It's what we could have done with those resources absent devoting them to, in your case, the wine production or such, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of, I say that a price is a signal wrapped up in an incentive. And the whole idea is that when markets and property rights are working well and well-defined, is that this money price represents the opportunity cost. So you don't have to know what's the opportunity cost of wine. You don't know anything about dairy and vegetables. I don't know. Could be tourism. I don't know. I don't know what it is. Okay. All you have to know is the price. And that tells you what the opportunity cost is.
Excellent.
So while we're talking about markets, let's relate that to living standards. Can you describe what the process is and why it is important in terms of the market process in improving living standards?
Yeah. So it's a very good question. Markets kind of do two things. One is they ensure that goods are used sort of efficiently, that goods flow to where they have the highest value. And in kind of the way I was describing with the tariff and international trade, that we get the most value from our limited resources, right? So another fundamental concept of economics is scarcity. And so we have a limited amount of labor, a limited amount of land, a limited amount of resources, and we want to use those resources in the way which produces the most goods, the most possible value. And markets help us to do that. So that's one benefit, virtue of markets. But the second virtue is probably even more important, and it's harder to understand. Economists don't even understand it that well. And that is that markets are part of liberty. they're part of freedom. And the freedom which markets allow one to have is the freedom to have the new idea, the new innovation. So Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, he said, the real value in markets is not in pushing price to marginal cost, okay? It's not in creating more efficiency. That's important, but that's not the main thing. The main thing is the innovation, is creating new products, new ideas. So people have new ways of combining resources to produce things of value. I mean, think about what is the most valuable thing in the world today? Like it's silicon, sand, right? For millions of years, sand was nothing. Okay. Just sitting there on the beach. Well, it's nice on the beach and whatever. Okay. And now we're using that same resource to produce thinking machines, to produce these chips, artificial intelligence, which is going into all of our devices and ways of living everywhere. So it's this idea that we can take something which we thought was of low value and through technology and ideas and turn it into something of high value. That is where growth really comes from. And part of that is just allowing entrepreneurs, okay, we're not going to plan this, okay, but just go out and, try and make some money and see what you can do. And it turns out that process of allowing people to take risks, venture their own money, be entrepreneurs, that just creates a tremendous amount of growth.
So while we're on the subject of markets, let's talk about markets and the idea of market failure.
Right.
And so I'm tempted to, in this environment that we're currently in with tariffs, I think non-economists probably view this idea of market failure in a different light than economists do. So how should we think about market failure, and how and when should government intervene in the market to correct what is perceived to be a market failure?
Right. So the first thing to say, I tend to prefer the language of sort of market challenges rather than market failure. Market failure seems to sort of build in the assumption, right? Instead, we have market challenges. And sometimes it will lead to failure. I'm not denying the existence of that. But let me give you an example, kind of a fun example. George Akerlof won a Nobel Prize in economics for pointing out a big market challenge or market failure. He called it market failure, which is asymmetric information. So his famous example was the used car market. And he said, look, the problem with the used car market is that the seller knows which are the plums, the really reliable cars, and which are the lemons. The seller has experience with the car. So the seller of the used car, they know whether it's worth a lot or worth a little. But the buyer doesn't know, okay? The buyer only has some idea about the average. Now, if you think about this, what this means is that the buyer won't be willing to pay for a plum even when the seller knows it's a plum. Okay, the buyer is not going to be willing to pay more just because the seller says, this car is super reliable, it's never broken down, it's really a great car, you should buy it, okay, and pay this higher extra price because it's so good. The seller says, I don't know, I don't have that information. I'm only willing to pay the average value. So knowing that, the seller is going to say, well, I'm not going to sell you the plum, okay? And because of the seller then withdraws the plum from the market, the average quality of car falls, okay? And what you can get actually is a spiral down to sort of zero. The market shuts down, zero goods, zero used cars can be sold. That's the asymmetric information story. The market for lemons, which rightly, won George Akerlof a Nobel Prize, great idea, very important idea. However, okay, the used car market is actually bigger than the new car market in the United States,
yeah.
Right? So actually used cars are sold all of the time, okay? And it's not that this asymmetric information doesn't exist. It's a challenge to markets, but markets have ways of overcoming the challenge, like inspections, like reputation. So I buy most of my used cars from CarMax, which has a reputation, which wants to have a reputation from selling good used cars. Otherwise, they won't get very many sales. So they also offer guarantees and warranties. So all of these things, like for example, a seller who knows that they have a plum is going to be more willing to offer a guarantee than the seller of a lemon. So a guarantee becomes a signal of the quality of the car and removes some of that asymmetric information. Carfax reports, another source of information. Anyway, so my point is that there can be challenges to markets. Sometimes markets have ways of overcoming these challenges. Now, is that always going to happen? No. So I think there are some big potential market failures. One of them might be, for example, climate change. Okay, so each individual emitter of pollution, carbon dioxide, has very little incentive to think about what are the ultimate effects on the planet and what are the costs of that. What is the cost of that going to be? And so you want to have some way of making the emitters of the carbon dioxide take into account those costs. A good way of doing that is a carbon tax. So you kind of raise the price to take into account the costs of the emitting this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So I think there are some market challenges and there are some market failures. And we want to think about how to address these using a clever kind of public policy.
I want to ask you about something in relation to the project you worked on that we mentioned earlier during COVID and the development of vaccines. And so your role in that was to help create ideas about developing incentives to accelerate vaccine development, if I understand that correctly. So was this an example of the government finding a way to help markets do their thing? Was this a government intervention because the market itself would not have done this as quickly? What's the relationship there? I'm really interested in that aspect of your work there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I could have gone to the government and said, do nothing, laissez-faire. Okay. But that probably was not the best thing to do. And I was working with a bunch of other economists, including Nobel Prize winner Michael Kremer. And so what we advised the government to do was, look, tremendous externalities. There were just tremendous externalities involved with producing vaccines. I mean, as you know, basically, the entire world economy came to depend upon a single sector, the vaccine sector, right? The entire world economy. So we are talking, there were losses of trillions of dollars, okay? Because people were afraid of working with one another and, markets were shut down and so forth. Now, the vaccine companies could not possibly recoup all of the value of their actions, right? So like without vaccines, the hotel industry was completely shut down. The airline industry was completely shut down. There was no easy, simple way for the vaccine producers to take into account that if they get it right, then the hotel industry is going to boom, the airline industry is going to boom, and so forth. So we said this is a good case to subsidize them, to take on some of their costs in order to speed up development. So the vaccine manufacturers, they would have produced a vaccine. It just would have taken longer. So what we recommended and what Operation Warp Speed did was we said, okay, look, the government is going to pay for the clinical trials. And that meant that you could have much larger clinical trials. So for the vaccines, we had clinical trials on the order of 30,000 people. It's a very big, very expensive clinical trial. 15,000 of them got the vaccine, 15,000 of them got the placebo. And then we were able to see after an amount of time that, the group which got the vaccine, there were far fewer cases of COVID in that group. Okay. But that was extremely expensive. The companies would have done it, but they would have done it on a smaller scale. And that means that it would have taken more time. So Operation Warp Speed paid for the clinical trials. It helped Moderna, which remember was just a startup. Moderna had never produced a vaccine. Pfizer was a big company. They were okay. They didn't take too much direct Operation Warp Speed money. Moderna was a startup, and Operation Warp Speed said, look, we're going to help you build the factory. Okay. The military came in and very efficient. Okay. General Gus Perna, in charge of logistics for the military. He was one of these guys who knew how to get things done. Okay. So they helped stand up Moderna to produce the Moderna vaccine. And again, it was all about getting things done faster because the markets alone would have been too slow because of this externality. So it's a good example of a market failure, and also what I think of as ironically President Trump's greatest success. He now doesn't want to talk about it, but his greatest success in his first term was Operation Warp Speed, and it was a remarkable, remarkable success.
Well, I know this is a little bit of a deviation, but my understanding is, at least in the U.S., the only intervention that proved to reduce cases, reduce transmission, to protect and actually prevent deaths was the vaccines. That masking didn't have much of an impact, that social distancing didn't. Lockdowns came down with all sorts of negative side effects that we're still trying to deal with. And it does concern me that there are still people, and some of them apparently now in the administration, who are convinced that the vaccines were the worst possible thing in relation to COVID that came along. And that really bothers me.
Yeah, it's very, very unfortunate. I agree with you entirely. And I think somehow the vaccines got associated with the lockdowns and the masking and all of that. But in fact, as you point out, the vaccines were the solution to all of that. Okay, once we had the vaccines, you don't need lockdowns. So you don't need masks. So my view was always that, look, if you hate the lockdowns, and I didn't like the lockdowns, who did? Shutting down churches and things like that was terrible. Okay. But if you don't want to do that, then support getting the vaccines out faster, because it's the vaccines which allowed us to throw out the masks and get on with our lives again.
Yes. All right, let's go back. One thing that's kind of akin to what we were talking about before we got sidetracked on the vaccines, which is, I still find that conversation fascinating and could probably do a whole show just on that, but is the notion of public goods. And maybe, kind of the vaccines might have fallen into that category as well. But the idea that there are just certain goods or services that are necessary to society to function, but that markets themselves aren't quite suitable or capable of providing those, or at least providing them in as widespread a manner that society would want or need. And so then we rely on government to either provide them or to ensure their provision. So I always think, the classic example of this is like national defense. But how do we determine what is a public good that markets aren't capable of delivering? And is it possible that what we believe to be public goods can change over time and does change over time? And do markets influence what we perceive to be public goods in some ways? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So national defense, you're absolutely right. Typical example of a public good. My favorite example is actually asteroid defense or deflection. Think of that like in Armageddon, the asteroid is coming, is going to destroy humanity like it killed all the dinosaurs, right? And just think about asking an individual, would you like to pay, $100 to defend against the asteroid? Now, the thing about a private good, opposite of a public good, like a pair of jeans, if I pay $100, I get the jeans. If I don't pay the $100, I don't get the jeans. Pretty simple. But think about asteroid deflection. Well, if I pay $100, I get really pretty much the same amount of asteroid deflection as if I didn't pay the $100. Like either enough other people are paying so that my $100 doesn't make a difference, or not enough people are paying so that my $100 don't make a difference. it would be almost impossible that my $100 makes the difference between getting successful asteroid deflection and not. So people are going to say, well, since my $100 gets me the genes, but it doesn't really get me the asteroid deflection, either way, I'm just going to buy the genes. So that's a public good, asteroid deflection. Now, the reason I like this example is that markets don't provide too much in the way of asteroid deflection, but actually neither do governments. Okay? Because it's not high on the voters' priority list. Maybe it should be. Okay, I think it should be higher on their list, but it's not. And so it's not automatic that a government will respond to a market failure, to a failure to provide this public good. As always, we have to think about what are the incentives. Do we have the right incentives to get governments to behave in a way which supports the social good? We have some ideas about how to do that for markets. Much, much harder to design incentives so that governments produce public goods, right? Most governments in the world don't do that. Most governments in history don't do that. Most governments in history, right, are actually gangs, right? And they're mafias. And most of what governments produce is private goods for, the rulers, right? So most of the time, governments don't produce public goods either. And we have to develop a series of institutions, democracies, education, the franchise, all of this, rule of law, incentives. We have to division of powers, federalism, all the stuff that Madison and the founding fathers thought about. We have to divide a set of incentives and institutions to actually get governments to want to provide public goods. And then we got to convince people of what actually is a public good, as you said.
Wow, that layers right into the next thing. So financial and economic literacy is a problem, it seems to me, in our society today. I'm curious to what extent you agree with that. We economists that teach this, are we responsible? Is it our fault if we not do our work? So what do you agree that we have, and I would say that this is at all levels of economic rank in our society. We have people that don't seem to grasp just the basic concepts of fundamental econ 101. And do you agree that that's the case? And if you do, what should we do to correct this, or can we?
Yeah. So I was in India not long ago at a sort of public policy conference, and I was asked, do you think that, there's a severe economic illiteracy in India? And I said, yes, there is severe economic illiteracy in India, just like in every other country.
Right.
So I would say, yes, there is severe economic illiteracy today, just like there has always been. So I'm not sure that we are in a worse time. I mean, certainly, policy is very bad, and there's a lot of bad things going on. Okay, I'm not sure economic illiteracy is actually worse today than in the past. It's never been all that good. For some of the reasons we talked about earlier. They don't call it the invisible hand for nothing, because most people can't see it, right? And it runs against many of our common intuitions. Again, as we talked about before, just the idea of cooperating with people who you don't know, who are thousands of miles away from you, whom you've never met, whom you may have a different religion, with, a different country. You may live in different places. Quite different people, and yet with markets, you're able to cooperate. But that's not something which people really grasp. They find it difficult to understand. So, yeah, I think there's economic illiteracy, but it's probably, if anything, it's probably better now than it has been in the past, but it's still not very good. What can we do? Well, That's kind of what I try to do every day.
Right. Yes.
With Marginal Revolution,
indeed.
Marginal Revolution. Let me let me be self-interested and plug Marginal Revolution University. Just blatantly plug it, which is our online platform for teaching economics, and we have two really excellent classes: a macro class and a micro class. And these are videos which are free for anybody in the entire world. And it's one of my personal pleasures, gratifications, that I regularly get, emails from students in India and Korea and Pakistan, Nigeria, saying, thank you for putting out these videos. I never would have passed my class without them. I've learned so much, and so I feel that I have students all over the world. And the more that we can do to take advantage of modern media to broadcast these ideas and help people to see the invisible hand, the better, because really these ideas, whether we recognize it or not, are the basis of our civilization. And if we don't recognize it, we are likely to lose our civilization. Particularly this idea of globalization, this idea of a cooperation across borders, we could easily lose that and revert to a more antagonistic, less peaceful time. Because along with the cooperation of markets, comes this idea of peace. Peace and markets kind of go together. Indeed.
It's kind of hard to attack your customers when they're buying your goods.
Right.
I was, as you were beginning to talk about that, I was like, if only there was an online platform that easily explained, some of these elements. So, and it is, by the way, it is a fantastic resource. I visited it several times and thoroughly enjoy it. So thank you for putting that together, because I think a lot of people can benefit from that. Okay. What, in your opinion, is the biggest economic myth or misconception that is holding, society back, the U.S. back, the world back? What's the one that you're just like, man, if we could just get people to see this more clearly, it would make such a big difference? Yeah. Well, let me tell you what worries me, what is worrying me a lot in recent months, without getting too political, but I'm worried about saber rattling with sort of China and this idea that we have so much to fear, about China, and that the rise of China is against the United States, and that now there's another power, and the communist power, and we need to rearm and militarize and worry about it. I don't want to be naive. Okay, there's some truth to that, but on the other hand, I think what we are missing is the benefits of a rich China. There are tremendous benefits to the United States from having a wealthy and a scientifically advanced another country, another big scientifically advanced country in the world. We would like every country to be as rich as the United States. Okay, so we shouldn't always think that a poor China, a poor India is in our interest. No, we want these countries to be rich, and here's why. This actually goes back to my 2009 TED Talk, where I made some of these points, and I said, look, the Chinese, in the 1970s, their annual per capita income was like $300 per year. They were incredibly poor. And they were dying from diseases of poverty. Life expectancy was low. Now that China is much richer, still not nearly as rich as the United States, but much richer than they were before, okay, more Chinese are now dying of cancer, okay? Now, they're dying of cancer because they're living long enough so they're not dying of malnutrition and the diseases of poverty, which used to kill them. But the fact that more Chinese are now dying of cancer means that the Chinese have a much bigger incentive to research and develop cures for cancer. And that means
that we are much more likely to get a cure for cancer when the Chinese are putting resources and scientists, okay, and money and time and energy into the universities, into the medical trials, into all of the costs. They're also trying to cure cancer. That's great. That is fantastic for the United States. You know, if an American citizen cures cancer, I will be delighted. I will be over the moon. That's worth trillions of dollars. If a Chinese citizen cures cancer, I'm 99.99% as delighted. Okay. You know, a Chinese citizen who cures cancer is going to also, those ideas float around the world. Those ideas are freely available to everyone. You know, it's like F is equal to MA, you know, ideas are available for everyone to use. So if a Chinese scientist cures cancer, that is going to be worth trillions for the United States. And we ought to be encouraging them to do more research and development in all of these areas. For too long, actually, the United States shouldered the burden of drug development almost alone. Well, now we've got 1.4 billion people who are saying we're going to shoulder some of that burden too. And we should be saying, great, that is great. Thank you for spreading out the burden, because with more people, more scientists, more engineers researching new ideas, we're going to get more new ideas, which are great for everyone. So again, without denying that great power politics is important, you know, I mean, China, as great powers to go, has been less militaristic than most. Okay. They haven't invaded anywhere near as many countries as the United States has invaded in the last 50 years. But putting aside that, which maybe gets a little political, okay, I worry that by always thinking about China as an enemy and as a trade enemy, that we are almost creating the possibility of a self-fulfilling prophecy, okay? If we approach them as an enemy, then we're more likely to make them an enemy than if we approach them not even as a friend, but as we approach them as a partner, okay? A partner in the world trading system, a partner in the world scientific system. If we approach them as a partner, then I think we're much more likely to create mutual gains.
This idea is not a new one. This idea that if one country gains, it obviously has to be at the expense of another one. I mean, again, Adam Smith writes about this in The Wealth of Nations, this perception that we have to hoard all the resources because if our neighbor gets wealthy, they're taking something from us. And so that seems to be there. And yes, I have expressed some of the same concerns, that it just feels like we've got people who have that threatened mentality pushing us to do things that's going to increase the threat themselves rather than reducing it.
Exactly. Yes.
We love communication that goes both ways, not just you listening to us pontificate. We would love to hear from our audience. If you have comments, suggestions, or would like to contact us about possibly being a guest on the show, please email notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu.
All right, let's shift gears for just a second. As I mentioned, I'm a political science guy. And I was really interested in a post you had on the blog on Marginal Revolution about the Borda Count method of voting, and I was fascinated by this. In that post, you make the case that the way we conduct elections in the U.S. often produces a result that the majority really didn't want. So let's start with that. How in the world is that possible? I go to the voting box, I cast my ballot. Whoever gets the most wins. That's obviously what the majority wanted. And you're telling me that's not.
Yeah, so it turns out that voting or group choice is just much more complicated than people think, or that most people imagine. So if I say, for example, that I like apples more than bananas, and I like bananas more than coconuts, then you can conclude pretty pretty strongly that I like apples more than coconuts. Okay. That's basically a part of the definition of rationality. Okay. If I prefer apples to bananas and I prefer bananas to coconuts, then I also prefer apples to coconuts. Well, it turns out that a group need not decide that at all. So people in a group could easily decide that they could vote for apples over bananas and bananas over coconuts, and then turn around and vote for coconuts over apples. So groups can have behaviors, which if an individual exhibited those behaviors, you say they're crazy. They're crazy. So it actually is completely normal and should be expected for groups to behave in crazy ways. Okay. And we see this all the time. So we have, we say, don't smoke, we're going to tax cigarettes, and then we subsidize the production of tobacco. Okay, right. Which seems kind of crazy, right? But you can't think about a group. You should not think about a group as having a set of preferences. Okay. Groups don't have preferences any more than groups smile. Okay. A group does not smile. A group does not have preferences. So because they don't have preferences, they can behave in ways which you would think would be entirely irrational. And so as a result, it's quite possible to show that democratic institutions can result in outcomes which not only the majority doesn't like, but no one really likes. It's very surprising, but it's actually not hard to come up with these examples. And the basic story, I'll just give you a little bit of the intuition. It just pushes that example I gave a little bit earlier of imagine if we have we can have a situation where in a democracy, they vote for B over A, okay, and they vote for C over B, and D over C, E over D, and so forth, until you get to, let's say, Z, and Z wins, or Z wins the final tally. And it turns out that everyone thinks A is better than Z, okay? So you end up with a choice at the end of your rules of order, at the end of your agenda, where you've gotten to a choice Z, which actually is much worse than an earlier choice you have. So you can have an agenda where B beats A, okay, C beats B, and so on and so on and so on to get to Z, and yet A is better than Z, and nobody likes Z. Z is pretty bad, okay, and yet that's the outcome, which a purely democratic process can get you.
Okay, so this layers perfectly into the next question. So given that voters can come up with solutions with outcomes that are not popular, that are not desired, what are the most important elements of the voting process that we need to consider to ensure we design a system that avoids those types of outcomes, but also overcomes the status quo bias that exists in our current models? Right.
So I should say, by the way, somebody wants to look this up. This is the McKelvey-Schofield chaos theorem. So if you want to find more about this, McKelvey-Schofield's chaos theorem. Okay, yeah. So to get to your question, what do we do about this? What do we do about these things? Well, it's hard because it turns out that another deep result in voting theory or social choice theory is that there's no ideal system. All voting systems, all systems of sort of aggregating individual preferences to create a group choice are going to result in sort of bizarre or paradoxical or unpleasant outcomes some of the time. Now, just because they're all flawed doesn't mean they're all equally flawed, okay? And it turns out that the system we use the most, which is first past the post sort of majority rule, whoever gets the most votes wins, that's actually one of the worst systems. So you can see, for example, pretty intuitively, pretty easily, that if you have 10 candidates, then one of the candidates can win with 11% of the vote, even if he's hated by, 89% of the population, right? So what do we do about this? Well, as I said, there's no ideal voting system. I tend to like what is called the Borda Count, after this 19th century French mathematician, Jean-Charles Borda. And it's pretty simple. It's you ask the voters to rank the candidates, okay, from most preferred, top candidate to the least preferred candidate. And then you give points to each ranking. So, for example, if you have 3 candidates, you give 2 votes to a voter's top ranked candidate, 1 to their second ranked candidate, and 0 to their last ranked candidate. Now, you can immediately see one of the advantages of this system is that our current system just throws out a lot of information. It only takes into account who you put at the top, who your most preferred candidate was. It doesn't take into account who your second most preferred candidate was. But that could be important. And the Borda Count takes that into account. So, for example, with the Borda Count, it's possible that a candidate who gets no first place votes, but gets a lot of second place votes, that candidate can actually win. So there's a incentive to be a centrist, to be more of a centrist. So imagine we have a situation where we've got Democrats on the left, and we got Republicans on the right, and centrists sort of in the middle. Is that nobody maybe thinks that centrists are ideal. But if the Democrats all say, well, the Democrat candidate is best, but the centrist is second best, I hate the Republicans, though, put them last. And the Republicans say, well, Republican candidate is best, centrist is second best, but I just hate the Democrats, I put them last. Okay. Well, in that situation, the centrists could actually win because they get enough second place votes so that they could win. So there's a incentive in the Borda Count to kind of moderate your views so that you don't, if you're a Republican, you might want to get some centrist votes. You might want to get some second place votes, or a candidate who goes for the center can actually win, unlike in our current system, which tends to make things more divisive. So that's one advantage of the Borda Count. There are others as well we could talk about, but that's one advantage I like.
Let's mention a couple others advantages of that Borda Count method that stand out to you, that make a contrast to our current process.
Yeah, sure. What the voting theorists have done is following Kenneth Arrow, who won the Nobel Prize in 1972 for this work, is they kind of set up, well, what are the axioms or what are the really desirable properties that we would like a voting system to have, okay? And one of the desirable properties, seems pretty obvious actually, is that if a candidate moves up in voter rankings, if voters think that a candidate is getting better, is more preferred, is more liked, okay, it moves up in voter preferences, okay, that candidate ought not to move down in the outcome, okay? So there should be what is called positive responsiveness, okay, which just means that if a candidate moves up in preferences, it ought to move up or at least not down in outcomes. And it turns out a lot of voting systems violate positive responsiveness. So any voting system with like a runoff, for example, which is pretty common, it's quite possible for a candidate to do better in preferences and actually then lose when they otherwise would have won. Okay, it's possible to go up in preferences and down in outcome. So positive responsiveness is a desirable characteristic in a voting system. And it turns out that the Borda Count satisfies positive responsiveness. Okay, so that's a good thing. And there are other ones as well. So that a Borda Count, a Condorcet loser can never win. A Condorcet loser is a candidate who would lose head to head against every other candidate. In most voting systems, a Condorcet loser, a candidate who would lose head to head against every other candidate can actually win. In the Borda Count, that can't happen. So it satisfies a number of desirable properties. But let me just finish with this. I like the Borda Count. Don Sari, who is a fabulous mathematician and social choice theorist, he's written some fantastic works. I recommend to anybody who wants to look into the mathematics of voting systems to look at Don Sari's work. However, not everyone agrees. Okay, and why not? Well, remember what I said earlier is that no voting system is perfect. So depending upon which of the desirable properties you think are most important, you can choose a different voting system. Okay, so that's a reason why there's not universal agreement. Although there does tend to be universal agreement that the voting system we use is among the worst, but there's less agreement on what we should switch to. Okay.
On that note, our guest today has been Dr. Alex Tabarrok, the Bartley J. Madden Chair in Economics at the Mercatus Center and Professor of Economics at George Mason University. Dr. Tabarrok, thank you so much for spending some time with us. This has been completely enjoyable. And really appreciate you graciously giving of your time to visit with us and our listeners today.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. You have a great weekend, and we will see you down the road sometime. We want to remind our listeners, democracy is not a spectator sport. See you later.
Hey everyone, this is Deborah, the resident Gen Z member of the Not My Generation podcast family. Not My Generation is produced in the Possibilities Inc. studio. This episode was produced by Santiago Ramones. It was edited by Santiago Ramones. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. Send a voice memo to notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu and you could hear your voice on an upcoming episode. If you liked today's episode, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and sharing the podcast with others. You can check out previous episodes on any podcast app and on our podcast website at notmygeneration.captivate.fm, where we also provide our show notes. And remember, you can follow Not My Generation on X, formerly known as Twitter, at NMG Podcast, and on Facebook at Not My Generation Podcast. We look forward to interacting with you soon.